Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. And Sheila is always a hard act to follow, and my graphics aren't nearly as nice as hers. I take notes every time I listen to Sheila speak. So I'm delighted to get a chance to tell you about the Building Efficiency Accelerator. It's the newest part of the Accelerator platform in terms of its organizational structure. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, but I want to start with why, and I know you've heard about this morning, but the reason we are focusing on the buildings is because so many of the technologies that we've talked about already, lighting, appliances, heating and cooling services, are all applied in the built environment. And thinking through and engaging on decision-making at the system level is critical for our success. In some statistics show that in the United States, while we've had declining efficiency, where we've improved the efficiency of many of our individual appliances through standards and codes, the performance of our buildings hasn't changed significantly because we keep adding additional electricity using devices. So thinking about how do you optimize your system is a critical part of this. But I want to talk to you a little bit about how we go about doing this. We, first of all, are focused on alignment between the national and the subnational decision making. So you're going to hear me talk a lot about cities, because in the context of thinking about changing and transforming the built environment, you have to talk about who's making the decisions, how are those decisions getting made, and how do we influence them. And so I want to focus on the city level, because a lot of the application of these decisions is done, whether it's through a city or through city programs. Just to give you a sense of the scale, and you may have covered this morning before I arrived, in India, 70% of the buildings that will be standing in 2030 did not exist in 2010. The construction industry in many developing countries is between 10 and 15% of the gross domestic product of those countries. We have to change the trajectory we're on in order to make a sustainable built environment to serve the people in the cities where we are living. The global population in cities is going to go from 54% to almost 80% in decades. It's a dramatic scale up of the built environment, and national governments and cities and municipalities have to manage this huge expansion of the urban environment and the built environment in order to succeed with our sustainable development goals. So what are we doing? And these are some of the statistics, and I'm sure you've heard these before. You know, buildings consume 40% of energy demand. We're focused on how do you transform the sector using policies and market interventions, aligning markets and policy to deliver economic, social, and environmental value. I'm not going to go through the statistics. I know a lot of folks have already covered these today, but buildings represent one of the most critical lock-in effects that we have into our infrastructure. And it's power, it's the buildings that consume the power, and it's our transportation choices and the urban form, the shape of our cities, that are going to determine our emissions from those cities for decades. The barriers, we know, are around awareness, performance uncertainty, lack of clarity within decision makers of which technologies to choose, how to apply them, what to evaluate, and how you build that decision. And then you have to think about, how do you budget for it? How do you get over the fact that you may be building a building you will not be occupying? So how do you manage those first cost choices? How do you manage tenants or occupants in those buildings? There are a lot of factors that create diffuse decision-making and difficulty in alignment between the person who wants that building and the opportunities associated with making it an efficient investment. So our focus with the Accelerator is that alignment. As I talked about earlier, we're a partnership focused on building opportunities for policy packages to address those barriers. The policies and the market, the businesses that are in that market, can work together to avoid the lock-in of the inefficient building stock, to renovate inefficient buildings, and to ensure that our industry is challenged and advancing our goals of sustainable development. And we do that by demonstrating, as a partnership, those opportunities on the ground in markets. So I'm not going to go through all of our partners, but we're delighted at the broad and deep partnerships that range from our city networks to the businesses that are working with us, and technical organizations that bring their knowledge to bear in this challenge. When we work with cities, we ask that they do three things. Fundamentally, they have to undertake a project, they have to implement a policy, and they have to create the tracking approach to doing that. That means setting a baseline and tracking and communicating their progress. And we recognize that in doing that, there's a fair number of things that go into it that we have to help support through capacity building. And that can be done through our partners. It can be done through many of the organizations that we work with. But ultimately, we want to be able to communicate very clearly what the policy was, what the success was in implementing it, where the barriers were, and what the projects are. So we focus on sharing a shared agenda with the cities that we work with. You've heard already a little bit about the approach that we're using, which is to engage broadly in a light touch model to help bring awareness and capacity to a large number of cities. Our goal is to touch 50 cities, to work in a capacity building arrangement with 30 cities, and then to have a deep dive engagement with 6. That's just for the next 2 years. So we have an ambitious program ahead of us, and it relies on the partners and the groups that are working with us to deliver those changes. We recognize that there is a fair amount of work that needs to be done to localize the challenge. So we work very closely in these sort of multi-stakeholder processes. World Business Council for Sustainable Development, for example, has had workshops in India. They just had a pre-workshop in Shanghai. They've done them in Jakarta in Indonesia. They've done them in Warsaw and focused on Poland. There are a number of different partners that have done similar kinds of workshops, building action plans, beginning to get an opportunity to advance those actions. And then finally, we recognize that there's a need to select among the policies. We view this as a journey between now and 2030 to double the rate of energy efficiency improvement in the built environment. And the partners on the ground in the cities and with their national government support select among the different policies that they're going to work on. We'll talk more about this portion of it tomorrow, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the menu of policies that we support. But suffice it to say that we move people through a process, and I'm sorry, this is probably very hard to read, focused first on making the commitment on what policies and projects they're going to do, assessing where they are and getting feedback from stakeholders. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we've done with Mexico City in 1 minute. And then focusing on sort of the development. How are we going to plan and advance this agenda, and how will we implement it? And then what's the improvement approach? So for Mexico City, let me give you an example. Mexico City is where I've spent a lot of my last 6 months, focused on trying to help the city. They had signed up at the climate summit. They had a federal national law on building codes. It had not been applied in Mexico City. There weren't the permitting approaches. There wasn't an enforcement mechanism. It hadn't been localized. So we spent 6 months focusing on what did you need to do to implement that local building energy code. And we had stakeholders that worked with us. We had 4 working groups focusing on retrofits of the buildings, because that was the other goal they wanted to act on, and how did you implement this local building energy code. So I'm not going to go through all of the details, but suffice it to say that we've spent 6 months. We put our recommendations from a multi-stakeholder process in front of the city, and they have provisionally adopted many of those recommendations, and they'll hopefully make the announcements at COP on their next steps. I'm not going to spend more time on this. I'm happy to answer questions, and then tomorrow we can go into more depth. Thank you.